Is JD Vance facing his biggest political test to date? The vice president has long questioned American intervention abroad, and now he's in the awkward position of being the VP to a president who has launched a war in Iran. And Trump says Vance will be involved in talks to end it. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid in London, and welcome to The Global Story on YouTube. Daniel, it's wonderful to have you on The Global Story, and I feel so bad that you're there in our bureau in DC, and I actually happen to be here in London, but it's wonderful to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've been a White House reporter for years. You have met JD Vance, the vice president. You have interviewed scores of people who know him, who know what his policies are, who know what his ambitions are. And so I want to begin with a broad question here, and that is, how would you say JD Vance sees the world?
It's a very good place to start, Osman. I think that the best answer is to say that he is a creature of his environment and of his era. We all know J.D. Vance's backstory, and we'll get into that, I think, in a little bit more detail. But he is someone who grew up and came of age in the Bush era, in a moment in time when America became involved in not just one but two wars abroad. There was a huge debate in the United States about what America's role should be in the world, what its relationship should be to its allies, how it should project power. And J.D. Vance served in the Marines. And that was a formative period for him that has really, I think, informed who he's become as a politician. So, it's fair to say that J.D. Vance, I think, sees the world both through the prism of his current jobs, but also through his own experiences, having grown up in the Midwest, having served in the Army, having been in Iraq, and sort of becoming disillusioned with America's foreign policy choices under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And it's interesting because, to people who lived through the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, Americans in the United States, they will remember a period of time when it was Republicans who were supporting intervention abroad, right? It was what liberals used to call neocons or neoconservatives who were pushing America to invade Iraq, to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, and Democrats pushing back, Democrats marching in the streets. And right now, there's a little bit of the opposite, and it is actually Republicans and those core MAGA supporters of the president's and now of Vance's who are requesting, pushing, demanding that the U.S. take a step back, that the U.S. become more isolationist, spend less money abroad and more money at home. And that has really been J.D. Vance's mindset writ large.
So we're having this conversation now in the midst of the war in Iran. And there have been reports that JD Vance has been tasked to help negotiate a possible resolution, a possible end to this war. And I was intrigued when I saw those reports, Dan, in part because Vance doesn't strike me as someone who's had Iran or the Middle East as a big part of his remit. What's your sense of why President Trump has asked him to be a part of negotiating an end to the war?
So, in speaking with people who are close to J.D. Vance, I do know and have reporting that J.D. Vance right now, the vice president, is not involved in the weeds of this negotiation. He has been tasked or floated as someone who can step in if the negotiations get to a more concrete point. Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, are leading these negotiations. They are the ones who are talking indirectly to the Iranians, who are proposing this 15-point peace plan that has come out in the last 2 weeks or so, and that are really trying to work through the details to see if Iran is open to any kind of a deal to end this war. Then we can send in J.D. Vance as an example, or as a symbol of how serious we are about winding down the war.
Before we can talk about J.D. Vance as vice president, I think it's worth reminding listeners how he rose through the political ranks. He, in fact, only became a senator in 2022 for the state of Ohio. And 2 years after that, of course, Donald Trump selected him as his running mate. And it was a rather remarkable turnaround for a man who had previously described himself as a never Trump guy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he even once compared Trump to Hitler, right? He had very
That's
strong
right.
criticism of Donald Trump. How has he managed to shape himself into the loyal vice president that Donald Trump needs.
Well, look, I think that all politicians sort of morph a little bit and change over time, to suit different audiences and different voters and bases. But by the time that Vance began to contemplate a run for office and then finally launched his first political run in 2021, 2022, this was the party of Trump, and Vance understood that. He went to Mar-a-Lago for a meeting with Trump, and it was a tense meeting. I've spoken to people who, with knowledge of it, it began with Vance sitting down and Trump immediately bringing up all of the slights, all of the criticisms to Vance's face that Vance had made of him in the past. I mean,
How
Trump
did
is
Vance
someone
navigate that?
Well, he showed the shrewd political instincts that got him where he was. He didn't pretend that he hadn't said them. He immediately apologized, I've been told, and said, "Listen, I got it wrong." And what I've been told is that Trump appreciated that candor, and that sort of helped catapult him, to the Senate, because then Trump endorsed him. And Vance is one of the first prominent Republicans in Washington to step out almost right away and back Donald Trump. And so Trump saw that early endorsement from Vance as loyalty that he eventually repaid.
Well, JD Vance strikes me as the type of person that the Trump administration calls when they want to have a particularly blunt, tough conversation. One of the first foreign trips that JD Vance took was to the Munich Security Conference, as often a venue where American vice presidents speak. But he went there and he berated European leaders, scolded them, whatever the word is you want to use. And it was a really stunning moment. How did you interpret that? And what did that tell us about how JD Vance was going to interact with the world?
It really was stunning. I mean, this was very unusual. This is the type of venue that's a sort of training ground for a vice president, where they can bring the message of the administration, they can sort of burnish their own foreign policy chops a little bit, and where they're expected to develop close relationships with allies. And instead, JD Vance showed up and delivered a speech the likes of which had not been seen in that venue. And I've spoken to European diplomats who were taken aback at the candor with which, he presented his own views, the rhetoric, the really aggressive tone. I have the speech pulled up here and I was rereading it. Ahead of this. And, he said that if you're running in fear of your own voters,
there is nothing America can do for you, nor for that matter is there anything that you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump.
But what he was saying, sort of in short, was that Europeans were stifling free speech in the name of political correctness. And he gave an example of someone who was arrested for praying outside of an abortion clinic. And, Vance's message was this was someone who was just professing his faith. And his argument to Europe was, you need to let everyone express the views that they want to express. He went after Europeans on that. And then he also had very harsh words on migration.
And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration.
He presented a lot of problems, and in a pretty hectoring and aggressive way that put Europe on notice. But he did win some praise from Republicans back home. And I think that's important to focus on because it was lost a little bit in the moment. There's a lot of criticism. But it was something that Republicans here, some parts of the party, some factions of the party wanted to see.
You wanted to see a politician go to Europe and stand up to allies?
Yes, exactly that. And to say, the sort of the free lunch is over. We're no longer
free lunch
going
being defense spending.
Being defense spending, being promoting and offering other forms of soft power support to European democracies.
This was happening in the context of the Ukraine war, right? And Vance did go and reiterate that message we've heard from President Trump, right? That Europeans need to pay more of their fair share. Was that part of his message as well?
But that was a more behind-the-scenes message, and it's striking that in that speech, Ukraine was mentioned in a single sentence. This is 3 years into the largest land war in Europe since World War II. That was on the minds of the Germans who hosted the conference as they tried to figure out whether they would need to step up support for Ukraine, for France, for the UK, for others, for NATO, obviously. That was the big issue, and Vance sort of glanced over it. He said at the beginning, we're hopeful that under Trump we're going to get a resolution to this war, pretty quickly, and then he moved on.
Now, shortly after the vice president gave that speech in Munich in February of last year, I remember this because I was on White House duty in my old job at NPR that day. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky came to the White House, and there was this epic showdown in which JD Vance played a rather prominent role.
More than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once? This
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting,
today.
have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
What did we learn about the vice president's approach to negotiations from what transpired on that day, in which he very publicly told Ukraine's leader that, that Ukraine ought to be more thankful for the support it's gotten from the American government and from the American people?
It was quite a moment. I was there that day on White House duty as well. It was, people who had covered the White House for years had never seen anything like this, right? A shouting match between the president, the vice president, and a foreign leader, a head of state. And we learned a couple of things, I think. If we look at JD Vance, the human, not just his policies and so on, but how is this person adapting to this role, right? And we just talked about his quick rise. He's not someone who had long years of experience in foreign relations and public service and so on. He's been in many ways thrust onto the national scene in just the last couple of years. And he didn't shrink from the moment. This is a delicate issue. The U.S. has spent already billions, tens and tens of billions of dollars in military aid and in economic support to Ukraine. It's changed our relationship with Russia to a certain extent, with China. It was a moment where people Republicans were expecting him to focus on the task at hand, which was how do you get Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin to find a way to end this war, which has killed so many people.
And so, Dan, this leads me to a central question that I have here, which is how you think this is all going to play out in the Iran negotiations. It strikes me that what we have here is not just a war between the United States and Iran. You have an important third party here, and that is Israel. Do you know how Vance has navigated that relationship with Israel and how that might factor into any effort to end the war?
It's a very good question, Asma. And I think that U.S.-Israeli politics and the relationship between these two countries presents a really delicate balancing act for politicians on both sides of the aisle here in the U.S. Democrats and Republicans are very careful about criticizing Israel. The U.S. provides billions in aid to Israel every year. It's written into the budget, and also to present the U.S. as the protector of the national project of Israel, of a nation state.
Though there's a strain in the Republican Party, it feels, that has been more vocal in recent weeks in questioning why the United States is participating in this war, and at times blaming Israel for entering or for pushing the United States toward this war.
That's right, and so that's the sort of the balancing act that Vance has been presented with. On the one hand, he does need to message to those Republicans who are both lawmakers in Congress, some of them, and then, parts of the base. He does need to message to them that he understands their concerns that, this war could drag on. It could, lead the U.S. into a longer-term conflict in the Middle East. While, on the other hand, Vance is trying to find a way to end the war, which is the objective of Trump in the White House, and that's who he reports to. So we know that Vance has spoken with the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So he has served as a sort of go-between, and Vance's style, his approach to this role has really been trying to not ruffle feathers.
In doing some prep for our conversation, I went back to writings and interviews that JD Vance has done over the years, and I came across this opinion piece he had written in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. It's from 2023, and it's titled, and I want to read this to you. The byline here is JD Vance. It is titled, "Trump's Best Foreign Policy?" not starting any wars. And so it seemed like JD Vance was articulating his support for Donald Trump as a candidate for president, in part because he was a man he believed would not get the United States involved in more foreign adventures and wars abroad. Here we are. In January, the United States captured Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And then the next month, the U.S. started a war in Iran. How has JD Vance been managing this all?
This isn't an easy moment for JD Vance. He is tied to Trump. He's tied to Trump as a political figure on the right. He's tied more concretely, in the here and now to Trump's record. And, were Vance to run in 2028, this will be a big part of it. And to a certain extent, vice presidents can raise their hands and they say, we don't make the policy. But on the other hand, they are expected to support what the president does. And I think it's fair to say that the public doesn't see a lot of daylight between the two, right? Distancing himself at times even physically. And I can tell the story from speaking to sources, and it's now public, that the night of the war, which began in the early morning hours of February 28th, President Trump was down in Mar-a-Lago in a sort of makeshift situation room there at his Florida estate with Secretary of State Rubio, with his Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, with others. One notable absence, Asma, Vice President Vance. Vance was not there. If we think back to those famous pictures of the Osama bin Laden raid, right, when the Obama administration went into Pakistan and killed Osama bin Laden, and that famous shot in a small room off the Situation Room where Obama was surrounded by all of his top people, right, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time, his Vice President Joe Biden, and others. And it presented a picture symbolically of a united team. And that is not the imagery that we got at the beginning of this war in Iran, which is the biggest foreign conflict that President Trump has gotten into, in either of his terms. Vance was not down there in Florida. He was, as I was told by sources, in the Situation Room at the White House. As you know, covering the White House, we don't know all the behind-the-scenes details. There are security considerations. There are scheduling considerations. There are all sorts of reasons why, in addition to the politics of all this, they may have been in different places. But the symbolism was hard to miss.
My final question for you is that we are talking about JD Vance not just because he's the vice president, but because he has been seen as the heir apparent of the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement. And a key pillar of that is that you're going to focus on making America a priority, which in turn means no more foreign wars. How do you think that JD Vance manages to balance these competing ambitions, right? He has the ambition to be the loyal vice president in this job, and yet he also has his own personal political ambitions.
That is the conundrum that has faced all vice presidents who have wanted to become president, which is to say almost all of them, with some exceptions. 2028 is a long way away, but as a fellow veteran of the campaign trail, you know as well as I do that it will be here before we know it. And in fact, everyone who is interested in running is beginning quietly to sort of feel that out, right? To talk to donors, to talk to advisors, to think about messaging. People will be announcing their presidential campaigns a year from now, crazy as that sounds, right? After the midterms in early 2027. So it's on the horizon. And the question for JD Vance is, how does he navigate that moment? The people around him, I think it's fair to say, are beginning or will begin soon to come up with an answer to that very question, which will be on everyone's minds. Are you any different from Trump? And he's going to have an answer to mount a credible run in 2028 if he decides to jump into the ring.
That's it for The Global Story. Thanks for tuning in. And if you want to hear more from us, our show, The Global Story, is also available as an audio podcast. You can find us on bbc.com or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.